Clara May Whitfield heard the bolt slide home from the inside. Harold had looked at his dead brother's 3 daughters, standing in 6 inches of snow, and he had locked the door. Lily still held the frozen flower she'd carried 2 miles because she wanted to give Uncle Harold something pretty. Ruth's hand found the back of her younger sister's coat. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And Clara understood, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that the last door in this world she had any right to knock on had just been closed against her face. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Now let's begin. The door to Harold Whitfield's house was good solid oak, and Clara had knocked on it with her bare fist because her gloves had worn through at the knuckles 2 weeks ago. She hadn't replaced them. There were things you stopped replacing when the money ran out, and gloves came before boots, but after food, and food had been the problem since Tuesday. She had knocked 3 times before she heard his footsteps, slow, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had already made his decision before he reached the door. It opened 4 inches and stopped. Harold Whitfield looked at Clara first. Then his eyes moved to the girls. Then, very briefly, to the sky. The way men looked at the sky when they needed an excuse the clouds weren't providing. "I heard about Gerald," he said. "I know you did." She kept her voice flat. "Harold, it's 17 degrees. I need to talk to you." "You're talking." "Inside." Something moved across his face. "Clara, my daughters are standing in the snow." He looked at the girls again. Ruth stood at Clara's right, 13 years old, chin up, jaw locked. The jaw of a girl who had decided somewhere in the last 3 weeks that she was the last line of defense and had organized herself accordingly. June pressed to Clara's left, 9 years old, burning with questions she was, for once in her life, keeping behind her teeth. And Lily, 5 years old, and still too young to know that some things couldn't be fixed with the right gesture, held up a small dried flower she had found pushing through the ice on the road 2 miles back. She had carried it the whole way. She'd wanted to give Uncle Harold something nice. Harold's eyes stopped on Lily for exactly 1 second. Then they moved back to Clara. "Martha and I talked about this," he said. "What did you decide?" It wasn't the question. She already knew. She had known since the graveside, when Harold stood with his hat in both hands and didn't meet her eyes once through the entire service. She had known, and she had come anyway, because hope was sometimes the only currency left that didn't have a bottom. "It's not that we don't care about Gerald's girls." His voice had the careful flatness of a man reciting something he'd rehearsed. "We do. But Martha's mother is coming in the spring. We've got our own household, our own—" "Harold." Quiet. Final. "Look at your brother's children." He didn't. "Look at them." His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the girls for 1 flinching second and snapped back to her face. Something moved in him. Not guilt, not exactly, but something guilt-adjacent that he was working hard to press back down. "I can't help you, Clara." Flat. Decided. "There's a women's home in Billings. Pastor Aldridge mentioned it. They take mothers and children. I could write you a letter." "Billings is 112 miles," she said. "In January. With $4 and 3 little girls." She looked at him. "Did you hear yourself just now?" "I'm sorry." He said it like a door closing. "I truly am. But that doesn't put me on the hook for what Gerald left behind." She looked at him for a long, still moment. 11 years she had known this man. She had sat at his table every Christmas since the year Gerald married her. She had helped Martha through her second confinement when the doctor was 2 hours away and Harold was too frightened to be useful. She had watched these girls call this man uncle. "Please," she said. She hated the word, hated the shape of it in her mouth, the smallness of it, what it cost her to say it. But Lily's hand had found the back of her coat, and Ruth was making that sound in her throat, the one she turned into a cough immediately so her sisters wouldn't hear it. "Please," she said again, "just until spring breaks." "I can't." He put his hand flat on the door. "That's my answer." The bolt slid home from the inside. Not slammed. That might have been easier. He just closed it, firm and quiet, the way you closed something you considered settled. Clara stood on that porch for 4 full seconds. She looked at the grain of the door. Then she turned around, took Lily's hand in her right and Ruth's wrist in her left, and walked down the porch steps without looking back. "Mama!" June fell into step beside her, voice stripped of its usual velocity. "Where are we going?" "Town." "But after town." "Give me 1 minute, June." June went quiet, which told Clara everything about how serious this was. The town of Creekstone, Montana Territory, in the January of 1887, was a place that existed at the bottom of the sky. The cold had gone past the kind that hurt and into the kind that simply was, like weather that had stopped being weather and become geography. The main street was packed snow under boot, and the sky to the north had gone the color of old pewter, which in this part of the territory, in this particular month, meant one specific thing: storm. 2 days, maybe less. She counted what she had. $4.17. A trunk at the livery old Silas Greer was watching for 15 cents. 3 daughters. The dark blue wool dress Gerald had ordered the fabric for 4 years ago from a catalog. His favorite. The warmest thing she owned, which was why she'd worn it to his funeral and hadn't stopped wearing it since. She tried Mrs. Tanner's boarding house first. Mrs. Tanner looked at Clara, looked at the girls, said she was full up, and closed the door with a politeness that was somehow more absolute than rudeness. She tried Tom Beckett at the dry goods store. 11 years of business. Tom came out from behind the counter, stood with his hands in his apron, said he was real sorry for her loss, and said nothing that added up to help. She tried Pastor Aldridge. He was a decent man. She had believed that for 12 years. He sat her down in a front pew, brought the girls water from the pump in the yard, and folded his hands in his lap with the expression of a man who had already composed what he was going to say. "Clara," he said carefully, "I want to help. But the church doesn't have the resources. I'm not asking for money, Reverend." "I know, but there is a place in Billings. Harold already told me about Billings." She kept her voice level. "I cannot get to Billings. I cannot walk 112 miles through the January mountains with 3 children and $4. What I need exists in this town. Tell me what it is." Pastor Aldridge looked at his folded hands. He was quiet for a moment that lasted too long. "I'll ask around," he said finally. "I will, but, Clara, people have their own—" "I know," she said. She stood up. "Thank you for the water, Reverend." Ruth was waiting on the church steps. She had positioned herself between June and Lily and the wind with the automatic efficiency of a girl who did this without thinking anymore, the way you stop thinking about breathing. "Anything?" Ruth asked. "Not yet. There has to be something." "I know there does." "Mama?" Ruth's voice dropped. June and Lily were occupied with a patch of ice near the railing, June narrating something to Lily with great authority. "We have enough for 1 night at Mrs. Tanner's, if she's not actually full. You could push her." "She's actually full." or she's actually decided. Right now, it doesn't matter which. Ruth's jaw moved. She had Gerald's jaw, square, stubborn, built for holding things in until it couldn't anymore. "I'm not scared," she said. "I know you're not. Whatever we have to do, I'm not scared." "I know you mean it." Clara put her hand briefly on the back of Ruth's neck. "That's what worries me." Ruth started to say something. Then she didn't. She turned to her sisters instead and said, "Come on," in the voice that meant she was in charge. And June and Lily followed without argument, because even June recognized that voice. Clara stood with her hands on her hips and looked down the length of Main Street and counted the doors she hadn't tried yet. There weren't many. She was still standing there, turning the problem over the way you turned a stone looking for an angle that hadn't shown itself, when she heard the boots on the boardwalk. She didn't turn immediately. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet away and didn't move on. She turned. He wasn't what she expected. Or maybe she hadn't known what to expect, and that was the problem. Tall, wide through the shoulders in the way that came from actual work. A dark coat dusted with snow. A hat that had been through weather. A face with years in it, not old, but seasoned, and a scar along his left jaw, old and pale, that he had clearly stopped thinking about long ago. He held himself with the stillness of a man who had made his peace with something difficult, and was no longer arguing with it. He was looking at Lily. Lily was looking back at him with the unguarded directness of a child who hadn't learned yet to pre-sort the world into safe and dangerous before engaging with it. "Something I can help you with?" Clara said. His eyes came to her, dark gray in the flat winter light. "No, ma'am." His voice was low, roughened at the edges. "I don't mean to trouble you." He touched his hat brim and took one step away. Then June said, at full volume, with absolutely nothing between the thought and the words, "Mister, do you live around here? Because my mama needs a place to sleep, and nobody in this whole town will help us, and it's really cold." "June," Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. "But it's true." "I know it's true." "Then why can't I—" "June." Flat. Final. June subsided, with the expression of a girl who considered this a temporary, tactical retreat. Clara looked back at the man. He hadn't moved. He was looking at June with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but existed in that neighborhood. The look of a person who had just encountered something entirely unguarded and didn't know what to do with it. "I apologize," Clara said. "My daughter doesn't have a door between her head and her mouth." "Nothing to apologize for." He looked at Clara, then briefly at all three girls, then back at her. "Ma'am, my name is Cole Hargrove. I run Ironwood Ranch, 9 miles north of town." A pause. "I was at the church delivering a supply order when you came in. I heard some of your conversation with the Reverend." "Then you know my business." "I know some of it." He turned his hat once in his hands, a single, slow rotation. "I have a foreman's cabin on my property, empty since October. 2 rooms, wood stove, clean well." He stopped. "Nothing special, but it's solid and it's warm." She looked at him the way 11 years of hard living had taught her to look at people, past the surface, looking for the calculation underneath, the thing the offer was actually about. "Why?" she said. He didn't answer right away. The question actually made him think. She noticed that. No polished answer waiting. "Because I've watched you work this town for 4 hours," he said, "and not one person has offered you so much as a cup of coffee." He held her gaze. "And that's not right." "You've been watching me." "I've been at the livery and the hardware store and the church. You weren't hard to notice." Something shifted in his expression. careful and deliberate. I'm not saying it to be forward. I'm saying there are 3 children standing in 17 degrees and nobody in this town has done a thing about it. That bothers me. You don't know me. No, ma'am. I could be anyone. Could be. He didn't blink. Ask around about me. 7 years I've been doing business in Creekstone. Ask Silas Greer. Ask Tom Beckett. He told you no today, but he'll tell you something honest about my character. Ruth had moved. Clara felt it before she saw it, her eldest stepping forward, not in front of her, but beside her. One quiet step. The step of a girl who had decided something. Cole noticed it. His eyes went to Ruth. Something crossed his face that Clara couldn't name right away. Older than amusement, quieter than recognition. He looked at Ruth directly, the way adults rarely looked directly at children. Good instinct, he said simply. Ruth's chin stayed up, but she was listening now. Her eyes were working, the way they worked when she was making a judgment she hadn't finished forming. Clara pressed her fingers into her palm. $4.17. No boarding house. No family. The sky to the north getting darker by the hour. What would be expected of me, she said. Nothing. That's not an answer, Mr. Hargrove. The corner of his mouth shifted, just barely. The cabin needs cleaning. It's been shut up 3 months. If you want to put in a kitchen garden come spring, there's a plot behind it that's yours to use. He paused. I don't have claims on how you spend your time. You're not working for me. You're using a piece of property that would otherwise sit empty through the worst of winter. And my daughters. He looked at them. Ruth, June, Lily. Each one in turn, with a calm, even attention that had nothing calculating in it. He wasn't adding up what they cost. He was just seeing them. I've got a hound in the barn, he said. Old dog, 11 years. About as dangerous as a fence post. Girls are welcome anywhere on the property that's safe. I'll tell you what's not safe and why. He looked at Clara. A working ranch in January is no place to be careless. My daughters aren't careless. No, he said. I can see that. Lily, who had been quiet for a remarkable 8 minutes, looked straight up at Cole Hargrove and said, Mister, is there a fire at your house? He looked down at her, and something happened in his face. Clara would try to describe it later and find she couldn't, not precisely. Something that had been held in one position for a long time moved, slightly, toward a different one. Like ice shifting in a river when the temperature finally changes. Not breaking, not melting, just acknowledging that something had changed. Yes, he said. There is. Lily looked at the dried flower in her hand. Then she held it up to him. I picked this for Uncle Harold, she said, matter of fact. But he locked the door. Do you want it instead? Cole Hargrove crouched down in the snow in front of her. Not quickly, deliberately, the way he seemed to do everything. He took the flower from Lily's hands with both of his. The big, weathered hands of a man who had been building something in the cold for 7 years. And he looked at it. A dead thing. A frozen weed a 5-year-old had carried 2 miles through the snow for someone who locked his door. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Lily. I'll keep it, he said. Thank you. Lily beamed like sunrise. Clara pressed her fingers hard into her palm and breathed once through her nose and absolutely did not allow what was pressing against the back of her throat to go anywhere further than that. She had made herself a promise at Gerald's graveside. 1 person standing. She was the only one left standing. She was not going to come undone in the middle of Main Street in front of a stranger and her 3 daughters, because a man had been kind to Lily. She breathed, twice, a third time. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, and her voice was level. She made sure of it.
"I want to be clear about something before I answer." He stood back up, the flower in his hand. "Say it. I am not looking for charity. I am not looking for someone to fix what's broken." She held his gaze. "I have 3 daughters to raise, and I intend to raise them on my own terms, in my own time. What I need is a roof and enough time to think clearly. Nothing more than that." "That's clear," he said. "Then I'll take the cabin." She kept her voice even. "I need 1 day to clean it before my girls sleep in it. I won't put my children into 3 months of closed air without cleaning it first." "Fair enough. And if this arrangement is not what you've told me it is, if I find out it's something else, I pack up and leave. No argument, no discussion." "No argument," he said. "No discussion." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way hard years had taught her to read a face, not just what it showed, but what it was working to hold back. Cole Hargrove was a man who kept things close. She could see that plainly. Close and dishonest were not the same thing. She had learned that difference the hard way, and she trusted the lesson. What she could see of him was careful, and underneath the careful, something else. Something that had the quality of a wound that had been a long time closing. She didn't know what it was yet. She filed it away. "When do we leave?" she said. "Wagons at the livery. 20 minutes, if that suits." "It suits." He touched the brim of his hat and turned toward the livery without ceremony. No backward glance, no performance. Just a man who had said what he meant and was now doing it. June grabbed Clara's sleeve the second he was 10 paces away. "Mama!" Her voice was a compressed explosion of everything she had been holding in for 15 solid minutes. "Mama, he has a dog! An 11-year-old dog! That's 77 in dog years!" "That means he's been taking care of it for its entire life, Mama. That means something." "June, I'm making an observation about his character." "June." But Clara's voice had lost its edge. Ruth was still watching the direction Cole had walked. Her face was doing that private, careful thing. The thing it did when she was somewhere between a question and an answer, and hadn't finished crossing the distance. "What do you think?" Clara asked her. Low, just between them. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He looked at Lily like she was a real person," she said. "Not a problem." Clara bent and picked up her end of the trunk from the church steps. "Pick up your end," she said. But she kept what Ruth had said, folded it careful, and put it somewhere she could find it later. When she walked toward the livery, she walked a half step faster than she had all morning. Ahead of her, a wagon she hadn't ridden, a road she didn't know, a cabin she'd never seen. 9 miles north, through a Montana January, with a stranger who kept a dead flower in his coat pocket, and an old dog in his barn, and something behind his eyes she hadn't named yet. And something else, something without a name yet either. Something cautious and cold and stubborn, pressing up through the frozen ground the way Lily's dead flower had pressed up through the ice. Something that felt, against every evidence of this long, terrible day, like it might not be entirely finished. The wagon ride to Ironwood Ranch was the quietest hour Clara could remember since the morning they told her Gerald was dead. Not because nothing happened, because nothing happened at all. Cole sat up front with the reins loose in his hands and guided the horses north with the same economy he brought to everything, and the girls arranged themselves in the wagon bed behind him, and the January road unrolled ahead of them through the iron afternoon, and nobody said much. The silence wasn't hostile. It wasn't the silence of Harold's bolt sliding home,
or Pastor Aldridge choosing his words like a man selecting which truth to use. It was just silence. The ordinary kind between people who didn't know each other yet and hadn't found the way in. Clara sat beside Cole on the bench because there was nowhere else to sit. She kept 6 inches of cold air between them, her hands in her lap, her eyes on the road, her mind on $4.17, and whether she was making a terrible mistake. "Cold's getting worse," Cole said, not looking at her, just weather. "I can see that." "Storm off the North Range. 2 days, maybe sooner." "I know what a north sky looks like in January, Mr. Hargrove." He glanced at her. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I expect you do," he said, and looked back at the road. 2 minutes of silence. The horses moved steady. Behind them, June was informing Lily in precise detail about the average lifespan of hound dogs and the specific evidence this provided about their new host's character. "How long have you had the ranch?" Clara asked, because the silence had started pressing on her in a way she didn't like. 7 years come April. Started with 120 acres and 3 good horses." "Alone?" The smallest tightening in his jaw. There and gone. "Mostly," he said. She noticed it, filed it away, didn't ask. When Ironwood came into view, she took it in piece by piece, the way you took in something you were trying to be honest about. The main house long and low, heavy timber, the kind of building that had stopped trying to impress anyone and just stood. A barn the color of old rust, fencing going further than she could track, and off to the east, set back from the main house by 80 yards, a small cabin with a single south-facing window. That would be hers. "Foreman's place," Cole said. 2 rooms. Stove draws well. Back window sticks in the cold. You have to lift and push at the same time." "I'll figure it out." He looked at her sideways. "I don't doubt it." The girls were off the wagon before it stopped. June hit the ground and ran directly toward the barn. Lily made a sound, not a word, just a note of pure relief at being somewhere that wasn't the wind, and reached for the nearest solid thing, which was the wagon wheel. Ruth climbed down carefully and stood with her arms folded, taking in the whole of the ranch with slow, thorough attention, giving nothing away. A man came out of the barn, mid-30s, sun-dark, blue bandana at his neck. He looked at Cole, then at Clara, then at the 3 girls. His expression moved through several different things in rapid sequence. "Wade," Cole said. "Mrs. Whitfield and her daughters will be in the foreman's cabin. Get someone on the stovepipe and chimney before dark, wood stacked on the porch, and have Dot send supper over at 6. Wade Tucker looked at his employer with the undisguised curiosity of a man who knew him well enough to understand this was not a usual Tuesday. "Yes, sir," he said, and made a reasonable effort not to stare. The cabin was exactly what Cole had told her. 3 months of closed air, dust on every flat surface, the smell of old wood smoke, and a cold so deep in the walls it had become structural. 2 rooms, an iron stove with a deep firebox, a back room with enough floor space for bedrolls and a trunk. The south window threw a pale rectangle of winter light across the floor that made everything look almost warm. Clara stood in the middle of it with her hands on her hips. "Told you it needed work," Cole said from the doorway. He hadn't come inside. "I've worked with worse." She was already mapping it. "I need a broom, a bucket, rags, and I need that wood on the porch before the temperature drops another 5 degrees. Wade'll have it here inside the hour." She turned to look at him. He was standing at the threshold with his hat in his hand and the dried flower still in his coat pocket. And he was looking at her,
with that direct, unperforming attention that she was starting to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered worth looking at. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Cole." "Mr. Hargrove." She held his gaze. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, and she hadn't expected it, the timing of it, the simplicity, he said, "You already paid it." She looked at him. "Walking this town all day and not once letting your girls see you break," he said. "That's not nothing." He put his hat on and stepped back from the doorway. "Supper at 6. Dot makes enough to feed a crew. No obligation." He was gone before she could answer. Clara stood in the middle of the empty cabin and looked at the door he'd stepped away from. Then she turned to her daughters. Ruth was already pulling her sleeves down over her wrists, eyeing the stove with an assessing look. June was crouched in the corner, examining something on the floor with the focused intensity she gave to insects and rocks of unusual shape. Lily was standing in the pale rectangle of window light, with her face tipped up toward the ceiling beams. "Mama," Lily said, without looking down, "I think this is a good house." Clara looked at her youngest daughter, at the certainty in that small, upturned face, at Ruth pulling her sleeves down, ready to work, at June already cataloging the corner. She breathed in, breathed out. Let it settle somewhere it could stay. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." Clara cleaned for 3 hours straight. She worked the way she always worked when something was wrong, which was to say she worked hard enough and fast enough that there wasn't room left in her body for anything other than the next task. Ruth swept, and she followed with a wet rag. June carried water from the well in trips that were more enthusiastic than efficient. Lily was stationed at the door as, in her own words, a guard. "Guard against what?" June asked her on the third trip past. "Wolves," Lily said, with complete authority. "There aren't any wolves this close to town. You don't know that." "I do know that, actually, because—" "June," Clara said, without looking up from the floor. "Water." June went. By the time the light had gone the particular gray-blue of a Montana winter evening, the cabin was as clean as 3 hours could make it. It still smelled of old smoke in the corners, but it smelled like clean old smoke, and Clara had learned years ago to count that as something. She had the stove going, and the warmth of it was the first real warmth any of them had felt since Tuesday. And she watched her daughters arrange themselves around it with the boneless relief of children who had been cold for a very long time and had finally been allowed to stop. Wade Tucker knocked at 6 on the dot. He was carrying a covered pot that smelled like beef stew and a cloth-wrapped parcel that turned out to be cornbread, still warm, and he set them on the plank table and touched the brim of his hat. "Dot says there's more at the main house if this isn't enough," he said. "And Mr. Hargrove says to let him know if the stove gives you trouble overnight." "It won't," Clara said. "Thank you, Wade." He nodded, turned his hat in his hands once. Then he paused at the door the way a man paused when he had something to say and was working out whether it was his place to say it. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I've worked for Cole Hargrove 4 years. He ain't a man who does things for show." He looked at his hat brim. "I just thought you ought to know that." Clara looked at him. "I appreciate it," she said. He left. The stew was extraordinary. The kind of cooking that had been feeding hungry working men through hard winters for years. Not cooking to impress. The girls ate with the appetite of children who had shared half a biscuit between them since morning, and no real supper the night before that. June ate without talking, which was its own kind of measure of how hungry she had been. Lily fell asleep between her last bite and the next, just tipped sideways against Ruth's arm, like a small tree in soft ground. And Ruth caught. She felt something press hard against the back of her throat and refused to let it go any further than that.
She got them settled. She sat on the edge of Lily's bedroll for a long time after the girls dropped off, her hand on her youngest daughter's back, feeling the rise and fall of her. Outside, the ranch quieted in stages. The horses settling. A door closing somewhere in the main house. The sound of a working day folding itself down to nothing. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay on her own bedroll in the dark and thought about Harold's bolt sliding home. Then she stopped thinking about that and thought about what needed doing in the morning. Then she thought about Ruth, who was 13 years old and had a knife under her pillow and had not cried once since the funeral, and how the thing behind Ruth's eyes was building up to something Clara was going to have to deal with before it found its own way out. She thought about Gerald, too, the way she always thought about him in the dark. Not the sharp grief, not the kind that arrived without warning and took your legs out, but the ordinary missing of him. The weight of the other side of the bedroll, the way he used to reach over in the dark when he knew she was awake and just put his hand on her shoulder, not saying anything, just there. She pressed her face into her arm and breathed until it passed. In the morning, she took the girls up to the main house at 6:30. Cole was already at the table with Wade and two other hands she hadn't met, and a woman named Dot, broad-shouldered, gray-braided, the kind of cook who moved through a kitchen like she had personally built it and intended to keep it. Dot looked at the girls when they came through the door and said, "Lord," in a tone that was less surprise than inventory, and within 5 minutes had put food in front of all of them. Cole looked at Clara across the table. "Sleep all right?" "Fine," she said. He nodded and looked back at his plate, which she appreciated. No performance of concern, no hovering. Just a question asked and an answer received, and the matter settled. The two hands, a young one named Pete and an older one named Cal, made conversation with Ruth about the horses in the east pasture. Cal told June that the gray mare in the paddock had foaled 3 weeks prior, and June sat up so fast she knocked her elbow against Lily's cup, and Lily grabbed it without looking, and Clara thought, for the first time since Gerald died, that her family looked like people sitting at a table rather than people holding on. 3 days passed. She cleaned the cabin until there was nothing left to clean, and then she started planning the kitchen garden plot behind it, walking the frozen ground in the early mornings to understand what she was working with. Lily attached herself to the old hound, whose name turned out to be Homer, and Homer submitted to this with the saintly patience of a dog who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. June lived at the paddock fence. Ruth found her way to wherever Cal was working, because 11-year-old girls and working ranches have a natural gravity between them, and Clara didn't have the heart to argue with it. Cole moved through all of it the way a river moved through familiar country, present, constant, not requiring anything from the landscape around it. He left her alone, mostly, which was the thing she noticed first and noticed most. He didn't hover, didn't check on her 3 times a day the way some men would have, men who'd given something and then needed to keep track of what they'd given. He said good morning at breakfast, and good evening if their paths crossed at the end of the day, and he said what was necessary, and nothing more. She told herself she was grateful for it. She mostly was. On the 4th morning, she was mapping the garden plot when she heard the raised voices from the direction of the main house. Not fighting, but sharp enough to carry across the cold air. Cole's voice, low and controlled. And then another voice, one she didn't know, with an edge in it that made her hands go still. She kept her hands in the soil and told herself it wasn't her business. Then she heard Lily's name. She was across the yard in 8 seconds. In the space between the barn and the woodshed, a man she hadn't seen before stood with his arms crossed and his chin forward. Broad, red-faced,
with small eyes carrying the particular meanness of a man completely at home in it. Lily was pressed flat against the woodshed wall, with Homer held tight against her chest, eyes wide and absolutely still, in the way children went still when they understood, without knowing why, that an adult was a specific kind of dangerous.
Cole stood between them, not touching the man, not moving, just standing there with his feet planted and his arms at his sides. And there was something in his stillness that was entirely different from his usual stillness. This was a loaded stillness, the kind that came just before something happened. "Kid's been underfoot every morning," the man was saying. "Gets in the way. Somebody ought to keep track of. She's a guest on this property." Cole's voice was flat and precise, the way a blade was flat and precise. "Which makes her my concern, not yours." "I'm just saying, Hargrove, a man lets strays wander onto his—" "Finish that sentence," Cole said, "and you'll be collecting your pay before noon." Dead silence. Clara watched the man calculate his odds and arrive at the correct answer, which was not much. "Didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. "All right," Cole said. "Get back to work." The man went. Clara crossed to Lily and crouched down and took her daughter's face in both hands. Lily was shaking, not violently, just that fine trembling that came from being frightened and holding very still so as not to show it. "Hey," Clara said, "look at me. You okay?" Lily nodded. Her face crumpled. She pressed into Clara's shoulder, and Clara wrapped her arms around her and held on and looked up. Cole was watching from several feet away, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He looked at Lily's shaking shoulders. Then he looked at Clara. "His name is Birch," he said quietly. "He won't be a problem again." What did he actually say to her? Clara kept her voice low. "Nothing worth repeating to you." A pause. "I handled it." "Men like that don't drop things," she said. "They store them. I know that kind of man, Mr. Hargrove." "So do I." His jaw tightened. "He works here because he's good with the winter herd and he keeps to himself. He crossed a line today. He knows exactly what it costs him if he does it again." He held her gaze. "I give you my word on that." She looked at him for a long moment. She had known men who gave their word the way they gave bad checks, easily, without any particular intention behind it. Cole Hargrove said it the way you said something you understood the weight of. She had learned to tell the difference in the first year of her marriage. She trusted the lesson. "All right," she said. She carried Lily back to the cabin and sat with her until the shaking stopped. And then Lily fell asleep in the middle of the afternoon, the way small children did after being frightened, sudden and total, like a candle going out. Clara sat looking at her daughter's face and felt the anger she had been holding in her hands since the woodshed finally go somewhere it could settle. When she stepped outside, Ruth was on the cabin step. "I heard," Ruth said. "I figured." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Her hands were gripping her own knees. "Is he going to fire that man?" "He said he'd handle it." "Do you believe him?" Clara leaned against the doorframe. The cold pressed against her back through the wool. She thought about Harold's door. She thought about Pastor Aldridge's folded hands. She thought about Cole crouching in the snow to take a dead flower from a 5-year-old with both hands. "Yes," she said. Ruth picked at a splinter on the step. She was quiet for another moment. "He's not like Uncle Harold," she said. "That's not a high bar, Ruth." "I know. I didn't mean it like that." She looked out toward the barn. "He talks to me like I'm a person, not a kid, not a problem." She paused. "When Cal was explaining the feed ratios yesterday, Cole stopped and asked me what I thought. Like my answer mattered. Clara said nothing. Papa used to do that, Ruth said. Quiet, careful, testing the words before she let them out. Ask what I thought. Like it mattered.
The silence that followed had weight in it. Not bad weight, just the particular heaviness of something true. Go check on June, Clara said finally. She's been at that paddock fence for 2 hours, and she'll have frostbite on her nose before she notices. Ruth almost smiled. She got up and went, and Clara watched her go, and stood alone on the cabin step, and breathed the cold air in and let it out, and tried not to think too hard about what her daughter had just said. That evening at the main house, Dot served venison stew and biscuits, and a dried apple pie that June declared the best thing she had ever eaten in her life, which Dot received with the expression of a woman who had heard this before, and still found it satisfactory. The hands ate and talked among themselves. Pete and Cal were arguing about the fence line on the north pasture. Wade was quiet, the way Wade was usually quiet at dinner, listening to everything and saying little. Cole sat at the head of the table and ate and said what was necessary, and otherwise let the noise of the table happen around him. Clara had noticed this about him, that he seemed genuinely content to let a room be full without requiring himself to fill it. Gerald had been the same way. It was a quality in a man that Clara had learned to value highly, because the alternative was exhausting. Midway through the meal, June looked up from her pie and said to Cole, without any preamble, "Mr. Hargrove, why don't you have any children?" Every adult at the table went still in a specific way. Cole went still in a different way entirely. "June," Clara's voice was sharp, "I'm just asking because you have a big house and—" "June, that is not your question to ask." "But—" "No." June subsided, though with the expression of a girl who reserved the right to return to this topic at a later date when the conditions were more favorable. She looked back at her pie. The table noise slowly resumed, Pete and Cal returning to the fence argument, Wade refilling his coffee. Cole looked at his plate. He said nothing. But Clara, who was sitting 2 seats away and was watching because she couldn't help watching, saw something move through his face, quick and deep, like something surfacing for a moment before going back under. He pressed it back down with the discipline of a man who had a great deal of practice at this particular exercise. He didn't look at her. She didn't look away fast enough. He caught her watching. For 1 second, their eyes met across the table, and in that second, Clara saw it clearly. Not grief, exactly, because grief was something you wore on the outside eventually, something that softened into the face over time. This was the other kind, the kind you kept so far inside that it had stopped having edges, the kind that had been there so long it had become part of the structure, like the cold in the cabin walls. He looked back at his plate. Clara looked at her stew. She didn't ask. She filed it away with the other things she had filed away about Cole Hargrove. The way he said, "mostly," when she asked if he'd built the ranch alone. The 6-room house with no sound in it after dark. The flower he'd put in his coat pocket and not taken out. Later, after the girls were asleep and the cabin was quiet, and the wind had started up outside the way it did in January, moving around the corners of things, testing for weakness. Clara sat in the chair by the stove with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire through the grate and thought. She thought about what Ruth had said on the step, about asking like it mattered. She thought about June's question hanging in the air above the dinner table, and the thing it had brought up in Cole's face before he pressed it back down. She thought about a man who had built a 6-room house alone and kept a dead flower in his coat pocket. She did not know what to do with what she was thinking. She knew that she was thinking it. That was enough to be cautious about. She put more wood in the stove. She listened to the wind. She listened to her daughter's breathing in the next room,
Ruth, steady and measured. June, chaotic even in sleep. Lily, that small, even rise and fall that Clara had been listening for in the dark since the night Lily was born. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, where the missing of Gerald lived, and held it there for a moment. Then she took her hand away, banked the fire, and lay down in the dark. Tomorrow there was work to do. There was always work to do. That was the one thing that had not changed and would not change, and she was more grateful for it than she could have said to anyone. She closed her eyes. Outside, the snow began. The snow that started that night did not stop for 2 days. By the second morning, the drifts had come up past the bottom rail of the paddock fence, and the world outside the cabin windows had gone the particular white-gray of a sky that hadn't finished what it started. Clara kept the girls inside, and kept the stove fed, and kept herself busy, which was the only reliable tool she had ever found against the kind of thinking that grew in closed spaces during long winters. Ruth read to Lily from the one book Clara had kept at the bottom of the trunk, a collection of frontier stories Gerald had ordered from a catalog the year Ruth was born, the spine cracked and the pages soft from years of handling. June reorganized everything in the cabin that could be reorganized, twice, and then started asking questions about the structural integrity of the stovepipe that Clara couldn't fully answer, and eventually redirected toward more productive territory. On the afternoon of the second day, Cole appeared at the cabin door with an armload of wood that was more than what was stacked on the porch, which Clara had been rationing without saying so. "Noticed you were running low," he said. "We were fine," she said. He looked at the stack by the stove. He looked at her. He set the wood down on the porch without comment and turned to go. "Mr. Hargrove." She hadn't meant to say it quite yet. "Thank you." He paused with his back to her for a moment. "Storm will break by morning," he said. "Ground will be passable by noon." And he walked back toward the main house, through the snow, without looking back. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, and told herself a thing she was feeling was gratitude. Gratitude was reasonable. Gratitude was proportional. She went back inside and put another log on the fire. The storm broke exactly when he said it would. The third morning came in clear and brutal, the kind of cold that arrived after a heavy snow, sharp-edged, purposeful. The sun off the snow so bright it hurt to look at. Clara took the girls up to the main house for breakfast and found the hands already out working the drifts, clearing the path to the barn, checking the herd. Cole was at the paddock fence talking to Wade when she came out after breakfast. She was carrying the water bucket, and she was not, she told herself, taking a longer route than necessary to get to the well. She heard them before she was close enough to be noticed. "Birch has been talking," Wade was saying. His voice was low and deliberate, the voice of a man delivering news he'd been sitting on for a day or two. "In town, when he went in for supplies yesterday." "Talking about what?" "About the arrangement." A pause. "About Mrs. Whitfield." The silence that followed had a specific quality. Clara stopped walking. She knew she should announce herself. She did not announce herself. "What is he saying?" Cole said. "Saying it ain't proper. A widow woman and her girls on a single man's property? No arrangement, no—" Wade stopped. "You know the kind of thing, Cole. You know how it goes." "I know how it goes." His voice had gone flat in a way Clara recognized now, the flatness that meant he was holding something tightly. "Harold Whitfield's been in Creekstone twice this week. He ain't repeating what Birch says, but he ain't contradicting it either. And in a town that size, that amounts to the same, 'I heard you.'" A pause. "Leave it with me." Clara waited until she heard Wade's boots moving away in the snow. Then she waited another 10 seconds, and then she walked the rest of the way to the well as if she had been walking the whole time. And she drew her water, and she carried it back to the cabin, and she did not allow herself to think about what she had just heard until the girls were occupied, and she had enough quiet to think it through properly. She knew this. She had known it was possible, that this was the specific risk a woman in her position carried, that surviving could be made to look like something else entirely if a person wanted it to badly enough. She had known it, and she had come anyway, because there had been nowhere else to go. What she had not fully accounted for was Harold, not spreading the fire, just refusing to put it out. She understood immediately why. Harold had made a decision on that porch, and the only way to live with that decision was to make sure she failed badly enough that he could tell himself he'd been right not to help. People were remarkably skilled at building the structures that protected them from knowing themselves. She sat with it for the rest of the morning, and then she went to find Cole. He was in the barn, working on a section of harness that had cracked in the cold, the kind of methodical repair work that kept hands busy and left the mind with too much room. He straightened when he heard her come in. "You heard me this morning," he said. Not a question. "I heard enough." He set the harness down. "Clara, don't." She kept her voice level. "Don't manage what you're about to say. Just say it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Birch has been talking in town. Harold Whitfield isn't helping the situation. The story is that you're here without a proper arrangement, and in a county this size, that kind of story doesn't need to be true to do damage." He held her gaze. "I should have told you yesterday when Wade told me. I didn't. That was wrong." She had expected him to soften it. She had expected the careful management of information that men applied to things they thought women couldn't carry. She had not expected the direct acknowledgement that he had waited and that the waiting had been wrong. "Why did you wait?" she said. Something moved in his jaw. "Because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was making it your problem to solve. And I was still working out that it wasn't mine to solve alone either." He picked up the harness and set it down again. "That's the honest answer. It ain't a good one." She looked at him. "It's an honest one," she said. "I'll take that over good." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to handle this. I want to go to Birch and make clear that continuing to talk costs him his position here. And I want to go to Creekstone and make clear to anyone who will listen that what happens on this property is my business, and I stand behind it." He paused. "But that only solves part of it. The other part—" He stopped. "The other part is Harold," she said. "Yes, I'll handle Harold. Clara, Harold is my husband's family," she said. "He is my daughter's uncle. Whatever he is or isn't doing in that town, he is mine to deal with, not yours." She held his gaze. "Do you understand the difference?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not retreat, not offense. Something closer to respect that had been tested and come back stronger. "I understand it," he said. "Good." She turned to go. "Clara." His voice stopped her at the barn door. She turned. He was standing with a harness in his hands and that scar along his jaw catching the thin winter light. And he looked for just a moment like a man who was about to say something he hadn't planned on saying. What Birch is doing, and what Harold is letting run. It's designed to make you feel like the problem, like your being here is the thing that caused this. He paused. It isn't. I need you to know I know that. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at him for 3 full seconds. I know it too, she said, and she walked out. She found Harold in Creekstone 2 days later. She had told Cole she was going to the dry goods store for thread, which was true as far as it went. She had not mentioned that she had seen Harold's wagon outside the barber shop from the road. He was coming out as she was going in, and she watched his face do three things in rapid sequence: surprise, guilt, and the performance of neutrality. And she did not give him time to finish the third one. "Harold," she said, "walk with me." "Clara, it'll take 10 minutes. He walked with her. She took them toward the end of the main street where it was quieter, away from the storefronts and the people who might watch, because this was not a conversation for an audience.
"I know what you've been doing," she said when they were far enough. "I haven't done anything." "You haven't contradicted anything either, and you know what that means in a town this size." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Harold, what did you think was going to happen? You turned us away in the middle of January. Where did you think we were going to go?" His jaw worked. He had the Whitfield jaw. Ruth had it too. Gerald had had it. And watching it move in Harold's face with all the guilt Harold was working to suppress was like watching a familiar thing in an unfamiliar place. "I made a mistake," he said at last. Low. The performance of neutrality was gone, and what was underneath it was not comfortable for either of them. On that porch, "I know I made a mistake." "I'm not here about the porch," she said. "I'm here about now. I'm here about my daughters, who are going to grow up in this county, and the story that follows them is the story that gets started right now, in this town, by the things that are said and the things that aren't said." She held his gaze. "I need you to decide what kind of uncle you're going to be. Not someday. Now." Harold looked at the snow-packed ground. He was a man, she thought, who had organized his entire life around not being asked direct questions, and she had just asked him the most direct one she had. She watched him work through it. She gave him the time. "What do you want me to do?" he said finally. "Talk to people. Tell them the truth, which is that your nieces are safe and cared for, and that the arrangement at Ironwood Ranch is decent and proper." She paused. "And come to Ironwood on Sunday, for supper. Let your nieces see that their father's family hasn't entirely disappeared." She held his gaze. "Lily has been putting Gerald's boots by the door every night since he died. She's waiting for someone from his world to show up and tell her she still has one." Something happened in Harold's face at that. She watched it happen and did not look away from it, because she needed him to carry the weight of it, and the only way to make sure he was carrying it was to watch him pick it up. "Sunday," he said. 6 o'clock. Dot makes enough for the whole territory." She walked back to the dry goods store and bought her thread and rode back to Ironwood in the cold afternoon and said nothing to Cole about where she'd been or what she'd done. It wasn't his to carry. She had told him that, and she meant it. That evening at dinner, it was Lily who created the moment Clara had not seen coming. They were finishing the meal. Dot had made salt pork and boiled potatoes and a dried peach cobbler that had elevated the mood of the entire table. And the conversation had settled into that comfortable end-of-day noise that Clara had come to recognize as the sound of people who worked hard together and had nothing left to prove to each other. Lily climbed down from her chair, walked around the table with the direct purposefulness she brought to all important objectives, and stopped in front of Cole. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. He looked down at her. "Miss Lily?" "Homer slept outside my bed last night." She regarded him with the grave seriousness of someone presenting evidence in a case. "I think he was cold. Can he sleep inside?" Every adult at the table was quiet. Cole looked at Lily for a moment. Then he said, "Homer has slept in that barn for 11 years. "I know," Lily said. "But last night he was cold." "How do you know he was cold?" "Because I was cold," Lily said, with the simple, impeccable logic of a 5-year-old. "And he was right there, so we were probably the same temperature."
Something happened at the corner of Cole's mouth. It arrived and departed so quickly that Clara almost missed it. But she was watching, and she didn't miss it. "I'll put an extra blanket in his corner," he said. Lily considered this. "Can it be a warm one?" "It'll be warm." "Okay." She turned and walked back to her chair, and climbed up and picked up her spoon, as if the matter were settled, because in her mind, it was. June was grinning at her plate. Ruth had her chin resting in her hand and was watching Cole with that assessing expression Clara was coming to know well. Later, when the girls were asleep and Clara was banking the stove for the night, she heard a sound from outside that wasn't wind and wasn't the horses. A single set of footsteps. Stopping near the woodpile, she went to the window. Cole was there in the dark, stacking additional wood against the cabin wall. Not the porch wood, the wall beside the window, where the wind came through on bad nights and stripped the heat. He was doing it quietly, without any announcement, and there was something in the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, completely without expectation of acknowledgement, that caught in her chest in a way she did not have a ready category for. He finished. He stood for a moment with his hands at his sides, looking at what he'd done. Then he turned and walked back toward the main house. He did not knock. He did not call out. He had simply seen something that needed doing and done it, and intended to say nothing about it. Clara stood at the window in the dark cabin, with her daughter sleeping behind her, and watched him go, and understood that she was in considerably more trouble than she had allowed herself to admit. She was not a woman who confused things. She had loved Gerald Whitfield for 14 years, had learned the specific weight of that love, knew what it felt like in her bones. She was not confusing this for that. She was too honest with herself, and too clear-eyed, and too tired for confusion. But she was watching for Cole at breakfast in a way she hadn't been watching 2 weeks ago. And she was aware that Ruth had noticed. And she was aware that June would ask about it eventually, in the blunt, unfiltered way that June asked about everything. And that when June asked, Clara was going to need to have an answer that was honest, without being more than she could stand to say out loud yet. She went back to her bedroll. She lay in the dark. She listened to her daughters breathe. She thought about a man who stacked wood in the cold, in the dark, and went back inside without knocking. She thought about the things she'd seen in his face when June asked why he had no children. That deep, quick surfacing, and the discipline with which he'd pushed it back under. She thought about the 6-room house. She thought about Eleanor, whose name she didn't know yet, whose story she hadn't been told yet, but whose shape she could already see in the silences Cole kept, and the spaces he moved around, with the careful habit of a man who had learned to navigate absence. She thought about all of this, and then she told herself to stop thinking about it and go to sleep. She did not go to sleep for a long time. Harold Whitfield arrived on Sunday at 5 minutes to 6 with his hat in both hands and the expression of a man who had rehearsed something on the ride over and was no longer certain any part of it was adequate. Clara met him at the cabin door. She did not make it easy for him, and she did not make it hard. She simply said, "They're inside," and stepped back and let him in. Ruth looked up from the table first. Her face went through several things in rapid sequence. Surprise, a flash of something old and hurt, and then the careful neutral expression she had learned to wear over the last 2 months, like armor. She said nothing. June said, "Uncle Harold," with the particular flatness of a 9-year-old who had not yet decided whether to forgive something, but had decided not to start a fight about it at the dinner table. Lily slid off her chair, walked directly to Harold, and held up the small carved wooden horse that Cole had whittled for her 3 days ago, when she had spent an entire breakfast explaining in exhaustive detail the difference between a brown horse and a dark brown horse. "Look," she said. Mr. Hargrove made it. It's a mare. The mare in the east paddock. Her name is Clover." Harold looked at the horse. Then he looked at Lily.
Something moved through his face that he didn't have the control to stop. A grief that was specific and personal and probably long overdue. He crouched down the way a man crouched when his knees hurt and his conscience hurt worse, and said, "That's real fine work, Lily." "I know," Lily said agreeably, and took it back and went to show Homer. Clara watched her brother-in-law straighten back up. She watched him look around the cabin, at the clean swept floor, the stocked wood pile, the dried herbs she'd hung from the ceiling beam 3 days ago when Cole had brought them from the main house, without comment, just set them on the porch and knocked twice and kept walking. She watched Harold take it all in and understand something that his conscience had apparently been refusing to deliver to his brain until this specific moment. "Clara?" he said. "Later," she said quietly. "Not tonight. Tonight you eat dinner with your nieces." He nodded, once, hard, and he sat down. Cole had been told Harold was coming. He had received this information at breakfast with no visible reaction, which Clara had watched carefully because she had begun to read him the way she read weather, not the obvious surface of it, but the pressure underneath, the thing that told you what was actually coming. He had said, "I'll have Dot set an extra place," and had looked back at his coffee, and that had been the entirety of his response. At the table that evening, he shook Harold's hand when Harold introduced himself, and the handshake was not warm and was not hostile, and communicated with absolute precision that Cole Hargrove was a man who formed his opinions from evidence rather than courtesy, and that the evidence was still being collected. Harold understood this. Clara could see him understand it. It seemed, to her private satisfaction, to make Harold sit up slightly straighter. Dot's pot roast did the work the conversation might have struggled with. There was little that could not be softened somewhat by an excellent pot roast in January, and Dot's was exceptional. Pete started an argument about the north fence that Cal finished. Wade told a story about a horse and a frozen water trough that sent June into helpless laughter. Ruth, who had been quiet for most of the meal, said something to Harold in a low voice that Clara couldn't hear, and Harold listened and said something back, and Ruth looked at her plate and nodded once in the way she nodded when she had received information she needed. Clara did not ask what they said. Some things between people were not hers to manage. After supper, Harold found her alone in the kitchen doorway while Dot was cutting pie, and Cole had taken Pete and Cal outside about something with the east pasture fence. "He's a good man," Harold said. He said it without preamble, without the careful approach of someone building toward something. Just a statement, an observation delivered to its destination directly. Clara looked at him. "I know that. I mean—" He stopped, started again. "I mean, the kind of good that I should have been, when you came to my door." He was looking at his hands, turning his hat by the brim, and she thought, with a small private start, that it was the same gesture Cole made when he was working through something difficult. Some things were universal in men of a certain kind. "I've been thinking about it since you came to town, about what I told myself that morning, about why it felt like the right thing and why it wasn't." She waited. "Gerald would have been ashamed of me," Harold said. She didn't tell him he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. "He also would have forgiven you by now," she said. "That was his nature. It was one of the better things about him." She looked at her brother-in-law squarely. "I'm not Gerald. I forgive slower, but I'm working on it." She paused. "Come again next Sunday, and the one after that. Show up enough times, and the girls will sort out the rest themselves." Harold left at 8 o'clock. Lily waved at him from the cabin doorway with the wooden horse raised in one hand. Ruth stood beside Clara on the step
and watched his wagon until the dark took it. And then she went inside without a word, which Clara had learned to read not as coldness, but as Ruth's way of processing something she wasn't finished with yet. She'd finish it. That was Ruth. She always finished. The thing with Cole happened 3 days later, and it happened because of a conversation that was nobody's fault and everybody's. Clara had gone to the main house mid-morning to return the pot Dot had sent the stew in, and Dot was not in the kitchen, and Cole was, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a ledger he was not actually looking at. He looked up when she came in. "Dot's in the barn," he said, harassing Pete about the feed inventory. "I'll leave this for her." She set the pot on the counter. She was turning to go when he said, "Sit down a minute," and something in the way he said it made her sit. He closed the ledger. He looked at his coffee. He had the particular stillness of a man who had decided to say something and was now having to find the door into it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Birch didn't just talk in Creekstone," he said. "He talked to a man named Voss, Emmett Voss. He runs a cattle operation 20 miles east, and he's on the county land committee." A pause. "Voss has been looking for reason to question the Ironwood land title since I bought the north parcel 3 years ago. We've had a disagreement about the boundary line." He looked up at her. "He's using Birch's talk as leverage. He's saying that if there's an improper situation on this property, the committee has grounds to review the title." Clara was very still. "He's going after your land." "He's using you to go after my land. There's a difference." His jaw was tight. "I should have dealt with Birch the day he looked at Lily the wrong way in that woodshed. I should have put him off the property then, and I didn't, because he was useful through the winter herd. That was my mistake. What's coming from it is my responsibility." She looked at him. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to Voss directly. Today. I'm going to make clear that the situation at Ironwood is—" He stopped. Something moved in his expression. "I'm going to make clear that you and your daughters are here under my protection and with my full support, and that anyone who questions your character is going to have to answer to me for it." It was the right thing. She knew it was the right thing. And yet something in the way he said it, the way it was organized around his land, his title, his response, his going to Voss, made something in her chest go careful and still, in a way that was not quite anger, but was not entirely comfortable either. "Cole," she said, "I know what you're going to say." "I don't think you do." He looked at her. She held his gaze and said, "I understand that your land is at risk. I understand that Birch created this and Voss is using it, and that this is a real problem that affects you directly." She kept her voice even. "But when you go to Voss and you tell him that I am here under your protection and with your support, what you are doing is making my presence on this property a thing that requires your defense. You're telling Voss, and through Voss everyone else, that the reason this is acceptable is because you say it is." She paused. "Not because I am a woman of good character who has done nothing wrong, because you have decided to stand behind me." Silence. "There's a difference," she said, "between a man protecting something that belongs to him and a man standing beside something that stands on its own." Cole was very still. She watched him take that in. She watched him turn it over with the unhurried thoroughness he brought to hard things. And she watched the moment it landed, the slight shift in his expression, the thing behind his eyes that acknowledged a problem he had not seen coming. "You're right," he said. She had not expected him to say it that quickly. She had expected the argument first, the defense of the intention, the "it isn't what I meant." She had prepared herself for it. "I'm right," she agreed, somewhat more gently.
And I know you didn't mean it the way it lands. But it lands that way. She looked at him. Let me go with you. Clara, let me go with you, and let me speak for myself.
You stand there, and you let Emmett Voss understand by your presence what your position is. But let me be the one who tells him what my character is. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not have my name defended as if I have. She held his gaze. That's the only way this works. Not you speaking for me. Both of us speaking the truth. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see the resistance in him. Not the resistance of a man who thought she was wrong, but the resistance of a man who had spent 7 years being the one who handled things, who had organized his entire existence around being the person who stood between trouble and everything inside his fence line. Asking him to step back and let someone stand beside him rather than behind him was asking him to undo a habit that had calcified over years. All right, he said at last. It wasn't easy for him to say. She heard that. She appreciated it. They rode to Voss's property the following morning. Clara had told the girls she was going to town, which was near enough to the truth that she didn't count it as a lie. Ruth had looked at her with those sharp, observant eyes and said nothing, which meant Ruth knew there was more to it and had decided to trust that Clara had her reasons. Emmett Voss was a wide, pale man with the handshake of someone who used it as a measurement tool, and the eyes of someone accustomed to finding other people's weaknesses before they found his. He received them in his front room with the surface courtesy of a man who had decided what the visit was about and was already ahead of it in his own mind. He looked at Clara with a specific kind of dismissal that she had encountered before in men like him. The quick catalog and rapid conclusion. The assessment that took less than a second and arrived at something reductive and final. She had learned not to take it personally. Men like Voss were not looking at her. They were looking at a category. Mr. Voss, Cole said, you know why I'm here. I have some idea, Voss said. He glanced at Clara. I wasn't expecting company. Mrs. Whitfield has something to say to you directly, Cole said. I'd advise you to listen. Voss looked at Clara with the expression of a man performing patience. She did not give him time to organize his condescension. Mr. Voss, she said, you have been told a story about my presence at Ironwood Ranch, by a man who was dismissed from his position there for threatening a 5-year-old child. She kept her voice clear and level, and her eyes directly on his. You've chosen to use that story as a tool in a land dispute that has nothing to do with me or my daughters. I'd like you to consider what that says. Voss's expression shifted. He had not been expecting directness. Men like Voss never did. I'm not making accusations about anyone's character, he began. You are, she said. You're making them through a third party, which is the way a man makes accusations when he doesn't want to be accountable for them. I'm standing in front of you now. If you have something to say about my character, say it to me. Silence. A long one. Voss looked at Cole, who was standing slightly to Clara's left, with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into an expression of absolute and patient expectation, and who did not speak. Voss looked back at Clara. I don't have anything to say to you personally, Voss said finally. The surface courtesy had acquired an edge, but something else had come into his face as well. Something that was the distant relative of respect, the look of a man who had calculated wrong and was quietly revising. Then I suggest, Clara said, that whatever Birch told you gets treated for what it is, which is a grievance from a dismissed employee with a history of threatening children. She held his gaze. I am a widow with 3 daughters. I have been a resident of this territory for 11 years. I have done nothing improper, and I intend to go on doing nothing improper. She paused. Cole Hargrove's land title has nothing to do with me, but I suspect you already know that, And I suspect this conversation has been about the land title all along. And I suspect that using my name to get there was the part you're going to want to think carefully about before you take it any further." She stood up. Cole stood up. Voss stayed seated. On the way back, they rode for a full mile in silence. The cold was deep and clean, the kind that arrived after a storm had cleared and left the air scoured and specific. Clara could feel the distance between them on the wagon bench. Not the careful 6 inches she had kept in those first days, but a different kind of distance. The distance between two people who had just done something together and were each sitting in the particular quiet that came after.
"You did that better than I would have," Cole said finally. "You would have handled the land title better than I did." "Probably." He kept his eyes on the road. "He'll back down." "I know." A pause. "Clara." He said her name the way he had started saying it somewhere in the last 2 weeks. Not formally, not as a courtesy, but as itself, as a word that had acquired a specific weight in his mouth. "What you said this morning, about standing beside something rather than in front of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing it wrong for a long time. Not just with you." She looked at the road ahead. The fencing of ironwood was visible in the distance, the long straight lines of it against the white ground. "It's not wrong exactly," she said. "It comes from the right place. It just—" She paused, finding it. "It just needs to know the difference between protection and possession. That's all." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Eleanor used to say I held on too tight." The name landed in the cold air between them like something solid. Clara did not move. She did not look at him. She gave the name the room it needed. "She was right," he said. "I did." And then she was gone, and I understood finally that holding on tight doesn't keep anything. It just means your hands are full when the thing leaves. He did not say anything else. She did not ask anything else. The wagon moved north through the cold January afternoon, and the fencing of ironwood came closer, and the horses moved steady and without complaint. And Clara sat with the shape of Eleanor's name in the air around her, and understood that something had shifted between them in the last hour that was not going to shift back. She was not sure how she felt about that yet. She was sure that she needed to figure it out before something else did it for her. When they pulled into the yard, Lily was sitting on the cabin step with Homer's enormous gray head in her lap, explaining something to him in a low, serious voice. She looked up when the wagon stopped. She looked at Clara. Then she looked at Cole. "You were gone a long time," she said. "We had some business to take care of," Clara said. Lily regarded Cole with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet learned to hide what she was thinking. "Is everything okay?" she asked him. Cole looked down at her from the wagon, and the thing that had been happening in his face all afternoon, the slow, incremental opening of something that had been closed for a long time, moved, visibly, 1 more degree. "Getting there," he said. Lily seemed to find this sufficient. She went back to her conversation with Homer. Clara climbed down from the wagon without assistance and walked toward the cabin, and she was aware, precisely and unavoidably, that Cole was watching her go, and she was aware that she did not mind. That was the part that required the most careful thinking of all. She thought about it for 4 days and didn't sleep well for any of them. Not because the answer was unclear. That was the problem. The answer was becoming clearer by the hour, and the clarity frightened her more than the uncertainty had. Uncertainty she knew how to carry. She had been carrying it for 2 months, and she had built up a tolerance for it, the way you built up a tolerance for cold. You just kept moving, kept your head down, kept your hands busy, and you didn't look too far ahead. This required looking ahead. This required standing still and looking at something directly,
and deciding whether to walk toward it. On the first day, she rehung the herbs in the cabin and told herself she was thinking.
On the second day, she mended June's coat where the left sleeve had torn at the seam and told herself she was still thinking. On the third morning, she woke before the girls and lay in the gray pre-dawn and stared at the ceiling and understood that she had already arrived at something and was simply waiting for herself to admit it. She was not a woman who confused things. She had established this for herself long ago. She knew what she had felt for Gerald, the specific density of it, the way it had changed the weight of ordinary things, the way it had lived in her chest like something structural, like a beam that held the whole house up. She knew what it felt like when that beam was gone. She had been living in the house without it for 2 months, and she knew exactly what was missing and where. What she felt when she watched Cole stack wood in the dark without knocking was not the same thing. She had enough honesty to know that. It was quieter. It was more cautious. It was the feeling of a woman who had been falling for a very long time and had finally found something solid enough to consider stopping. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerable. On the fourth morning, Dot found her at the kitchen table in the main house after breakfast, after the girls had gone out with Wade and Cole had gone to the north pasture about a section of fence the last storm had taken down. Dot set a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across from her with the direct efficiency of a woman who had decided something and had arranged the circumstances accordingly. "He built the room," Dot said, without preamble. Clara looked at her. "What room?" "Off the east side of the house, 3 years ago. Spring." Dot wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Eleanor died in the winter of 1880. Fever, 2 days after the baby. The baby didn't make it either." She said it plainly, not cruelly, the way you said things that needed to be said, and that softening would only make harder to receive. Cole didn't talk about it. Didn't talk about much of anything for about a year. Built the north pasture fence instead. Then the barn extension. Then the east room. Clara was very still. "He never said what it was for," Dot said. "Didn't have to. I've known Cole Hargrove since he was 31 years old, and had 120 acres and more stubbornness than sense. And I know what a man does when he's building something to put hope in." She looked at Clara steadily. "That room has been sitting empty for 3 years. Clara looked at her coffee. "Dot," she said finally, "I'm not going to ask what you think I should do." "Good," Dot said, "because I wasn't going to tell you." She stood up and took her cup back to the counter. "I'm just telling you what I know. What you do with it is your own business." She paused. "It always was." She went back to her kitchen. Clara sat with her coffee and the information and the specific quality of silence that a large house had when only one person lived in it, and she thought about a man who built a room for someone he hadn't met yet and then put a lock on his own heart and called it practicality. She found Cole at the fence line at noon. She had told herself she was bringing lunch out to the hands, which was true, and which gave her hands something to do on the ride out and gave her mind something practical to organize itself around. Wade took his food and went tactfully to the far end of the section with Pete. Cole took his and leaned against the fence post and looked at her with those gray eyes that had stopped pretending not to see things. "You've been thinking," he said. "I have." "About what?" She looked at him. "About Eleanor." Something moved through him. She watched it happen. The deep, involuntary flinch, the quick tightening, and then the discipline of a man who had learned to absorb things without letting them show. He looked at the fence line. "Dot told you." "Some of it. Enough." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not asking about Eleanor because I need to understand your past, Cole. I'm asking because I need to understand what you're offering." She held his gaze when he turned back to her.
Because whatever you've been doing these past weeks, the wood on the wall, the flower in your pocket, the way you look at my daughters, I need to know if that's a man who's ready to let something be real again, or if it's a man who's been alone long enough that kindness has started to look like something else. The silence that followed had the weight of the entire landscape in it. The cold, the fence, the long white reach of the north pasture. "That's the most honest question anyone's asked me in 7 years," he said.
"I'm a direct woman, Mr. Hargrove." Cole. Cole. She said it for the first time without the formality, and it felt different in her mouth than she had expected. More settled. More like itself. "Answer me honestly." He was quiet for a long moment, not avoiding it, working toward it the way he worked toward everything, deliberately, without rushing, giving it the weight it deserved. "Eleanor was the best person I knew," he said, "and I held on to her so tight that when she left, I couldn't figure out what my hands were for." He looked at the fence post. "I built things for 7 years because building things meant my hands had a purpose. And I told myself that was enough." He paused. "And then you knocked on the door of the church in the middle of January with 3 little girls and $4. And the way you stood there—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "Like the world had done its worst, and you were still standing. And you weren't asking permission from anyone for that." He looked at her directly. "I saw someone who knew how to be alive, even when being alive was the hardest possible thing." A pause. "I hadn't seen that in a long time. I've forgotten what it looked like." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do, and she had passed the point of pretending otherwise. "I'm not Eleanor," she said. "I know that. And I'm not a woman who needs someone to carry her. I've been doing my own carrying for a long time." "I know that too. My daughters come before everything. Before everything, Cole. Always." "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said. And he said it without hesitation, without the slight delay that would have told her he was performing the correct answer. He said it like it was simply true, the way he said true things. She turned and looked out at the pasture. The snow was old now, compacted and gray at the edges, and the sky had the pale, specific blue of a Montana January afternoon that had decided to be gentle for once. She thought about Gerald. She let herself think about him fully, the way she tried not to do in public, the way she only did in the dark. His hands, his laugh, the way he'd said her name the morning June was born, like it was the only word in the language. She let herself carry that for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not saying yes." Cole waited. "I'm saying I've stopped pretending I'm not thinking about it." She turned back to him. "And I think you deserve to know that. Because you've been decent, and you've been honest, and you haven't pushed. And a man who doesn't push deserves more than a woman who keeps her cards so close to her chest she forgets she's holding them." Something moved through his face, slow and careful, the way light moved into a room that had been dark for a long time. Not flooding in, but arriving, finding the corners, understanding the space. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She picked up the empty lunch pail. "I'll think a little longer," she said. "Take all the time you need." She rode back to the ranch and walked into the cabin and stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides and looked at what she had built in this space. The clean floor, the dried herbs, the girls' drawings tacked to the wall beside the window that June had put up last week without asking. Little pencil horses and a large gray shape that was presumably Homer, and a tall figure in a dark hat that Clara had looked at for a long time without saying anything. She looked at that drawing now, the tall figure,
June's unedited version of the world, which was always the most accurate version. She heard the cabin door open behind her. She turned. Ruth stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and snow on her boots, and the look on her face that meant she had been thinking about something for several days and had finished. "Mama," she said. "Ruth, I need to say something." "Then say it." Ruth came inside and closed the door behind her. She stood with her back against it and looked at Clara with those eyes that saw too much for 13 years old, and always had. "I've been watching you not decide something for 4 days," she said. "And I've been watching him not push you for longer than that. And She stopped. Her jaw worked. "Papa's been gone 2 months. I know that. I know how fast that is. And I have feelings about how fast that is that I haven't finished with yet." She met Clara's eyes. "But I also know what I see." "What do you see?" Clara said softly. Ruth looked at her hands, then up. "I see a man who asked me what I thought about the feed rotation the first week we were here, because Cal mentioned it at breakfast. And Cole looked at me and said, 'What do you think, Ruth?' Like I was a person with an opinion worth hearing." Her voice was doing the thing it did when she was holding something carefully, carrying it without spilling it. "Papa did that. Papa always did that." She swallowed. "And I know he's not Papa. I know that's not what this is. But I think—" She stopped again. "You think what?" Clara said. "I think Papa would have read him in about 30 seconds, Ruth said. "And I think he would have said he was all right." The silence between them had the particular warmth of something true, passing between two people who loved each other enough to say the hard thing. Clara crossed the room and put her arms around her daughter. Ruth stood with her arms at her sides for exactly 3 seconds. The amount of time Ruth always allowed before accepting comfort, as if she needed to confirm for herself that she was choosing it. And then she leaned in and put her forehead against her mother's shoulder and stayed there. "I haven't decided anything yet," Clara said into Ruth's hair. "I know," Ruth said. "I just wanted you to know that when you do, you don't have to worry about me." She straightened up, cleared her throat, stepped back and was 13 again, composed and self-contained and carrying more than she should have to carry. "I've got June and Lily, whatever you decide." "You are," Clara said, "an extraordinary person." "I know," Ruth said, with just enough of a smile to mean it, and went back outside. Clara stood alone in the cabin for a long time after the door closed. That evening, she did not wait for something to happen. She put the girls to bed herself, all 3, sat with Lily until she dropped off, checked that Homer was settled in his corner of the barn with the warm blanket Cole had put there 3 weeks ago and had quietly replaced twice since. She walked back to the main house in the cold dark and knocked on the door. Cole opened it. He looked at her face. He said nothing. "I've finished thinking," she said. He stepped back and let her in. The main room was warm, the fire built high against the January night, the lamp on the table making everything amber and close. She had been in this room a dozen times for meals, and twice for practical conversations, and once to look for June, who had wandered in to ask Dot about something, and stayed for 2 hours. She knew this room, but she had not been in it alone with Cole before, and the difference was specific and real, and she stood in it without pretending it wasn't. "I need to ask you something first," she said. "Ask it." "The room off the east side of the house." She watched his face. "Dot told me. Not everything. Enough." She held his gaze. "I need to know that if this becomes something real, it becomes something new. Not a replacement. Not me standing in a shape that was made for someone else." She kept her voice even. "Eleanor deserves better than that, and so do I." The fire moved. The lamp threw their shadows long and still against the wall. "Eleanor deserves a man who learned from her," Cole said quietly, "who took what she gave him and stopped wasting it on 7 years of fence building." He looked at Clara directly, with those gray eyes that had never, not once in all the weeks she'd known him, looked at her like a problem to be managed. "What I'm offering you isn't the same shape as what I had. It couldn't be. You're not the same shape as anything I've known before." He paused. "You're Clara Whitfield. You argued with Emmett Voss in his own front room.
You cleaned a frozen cabin with your bare hands on the worst day of your life. You raised 3 daughters who are the bravest people I have met in 7 years." He stopped, breathed. "I'm not asking you to fit anything. I'm asking you to let me build something that fits what you actually are." She was quiet for a moment. She was quiet because she needed the moment to be what it was, real, and hers, and not rushed past in the direction of what came next. "Cole," she said. "Clara." "I've been falling since November," she said. "I would like to stop falling." He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hand against her face the way a man touched something he understood the value of. Carefully, and with both intention and restraint, and with the particular tenderness of someone who had been waiting long enough to have learned the difference between wanting something and being ready for it. She put her hand over his and held it there. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions, and I keep them. My daughters come first, always. I will not be managed or handled or spoken for." "I know all of that," he said. "And I'm still grieving," she said. "I'm going to grieve for Gerald for a long time. That doesn't stop. It shouldn't stop." His thumb moved once against her cheek. "He gave you Ruth and June and Lily. He gets to be grieved." She looked at him. The fire moved behind him. Outside, the January wind found the corners of the house and tested them, and found them solid, the way it had been testing this house for 7 years and finding it solid every time. "Ask me properly," she said. He took both her hands in his. He looked at her with the quiet, total certainty of a man who had arrived somewhere he intended to stay. "Clara May Whitfield," he said, "would you let me be someone worth standing next to? Not in front of, not behind. Next to." She had been turning it over for 4 days. She had measured it against everything she knew about herself and her daughters, and what was real and what mattered. She had held it up against Gerald's memory and found that it didn't diminish that memory. It stood alongside it, the way 2 true things could stand alongside each other without either one becoming less. "Yes," she said. Not because it was practical, not because it solved the problem of Birch and Voss and Harold and the cold and the $4 that were long gone, but because it was true, and Clara Whitfield had never in her life been able to choose anything over the truth. He breathed out slowly, and she watched the last of the contained fear go out of him. 7 years of it, leaving in one long exhale. He kissed her once, gently, his hands steady and certain and warm. She pulled back and looked at him, and felt something she had not felt since the morning Gerald rode out for the last time and waved at her from the road, and she had stood on the porch and waved back, not knowing it was the last time, not knowing anything except that she was standing on solid ground with everything she loved in sight. She was standing on solid ground again. Different ground, new ground, but solid all the way down. "I have to get back," she said. "Lily wakes up in the night sometimes. She still puts Gerald's boots by the door." "I know she does," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Ruth told me, a week ago."
He looked at her steadily. She said she wanted me to know what we were all carrying, so I'd understand what I was asking.
Clara stood in the amber warmth of the room and thought about her 13-year-old daughter going to this man alone and laying down the truth of their grief like a map, saying, "Here is the territory, here is what it costs, here is what we need." She thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, "She's going to be remarkable." "She already is," Cole said. She walked back to the cabin through the cold dark, with the snow hard and certain under her boots, and the stars enormous overhead, in the way they were only enormous in winter, when the air was clean enough to let them through. She opened the cabin door quietly. Ruth was asleep. June was starfished across her bedroll, with one arm hanging off the edge. Lily was curled on her side, with her small hand pressed flat on the floor beside Gerald's boots, which stood in their place by the door the way they stood every night. Clara crouched down. She put her hand over Lily's hand for a moment. She looked at the boots. Then she looked at her daughters, at Ruth, straight and still and carrying everything without showing it. At June, collapsed in the beautiful chaos of a child who had given every last thing to the day. At Lily, with her hand on the floor and her face peaceful and her whole small self certain, even in sleep, that the people she loved were close. She thought about what it meant to stop falling. It meant landing somewhere. It meant a man who asked what you thought like it mattered, and stacked wood in the dark without knocking, and kept a dead flower in his coat pocket, and built a room for someone he hadn't met yet, and loved a dog for 11 years through every hard winter Montana could produce. It meant 3 daughters who were going to be all right, who were already, in every way that mattered, more than all right. It meant this cold cabin, these breathing girls, this ground under her feet that had been frozen and unforgiving and was, come spring, going to yield the best kitchen garden this territory had ever seen. She had already decided which corner got the beans. Clara Whitfield had come to Ironwood Ranch with nothing but her daughters and the stubborn refusal to fall all the way down. She had been locked out, turned away, talked about, and left in the cold by every person she had a right to expect better from. And she had built something anyway. Not with luck, not with rescue, but with her own 2 hands and her own clear eyes and the particular fierce grace of a woman who understood that the ground did not come to you. You walked toward it, one honest step at a time, until it held. And this ground held. It held all the way down.